My name is Colette Sweetnicki. Tonight we have our treasured Welshleyan, Helena Kennedy, back to tell us about what's going on in Britain, along with fellow Brit colleague, journalist and TV newscaster John Snow. First, as always, thanks to the Wellfleet Library for existing and helping us produce this series. To the head librarian, Jennifer Worthen, and to my two immediate partners, Naomi Robbins and Gabrielle Britton. There's two presentations that remain in this series for the summer. Next Tuesday, August 20th, we have Aviva Chomsky, who returns to speak about climate change and immigration, uncovering the connections. And in the last Tuesday in August, the 27th, NYU history professor Linda Gordon, who was originally going to talk about the photographer Inge Morath, she called and said, "How can I talk about photography with that guy in the White House?" So she changed it to Populism and/or Fascism, Lessons from the 1920s Ku Klux Klan. Her book, The Second Coming of the KKK, was published in 2017. On to tonight's presenters. Helena Kennedy, daughter of labor activists, is a distinguished British barrister and an expert in human rights law, civil liberties, and constitutional issues. She's a member of the House of Lords, where her notoriety includes refusing to abide by the party principle and voting the party line in place of her own ideological stance, a record of 33.3% of the time, which is more frequent than any other Labour peer. She's used many public platforms, including the House of Lords, to argue with passion, wit, and humanity for social justice. She has written and broadcast on a wide range of issues, from medical negligence to terrorism to the rights of women and children. She was a seminal force in promoting equal opportunities for women at the bar, a singular voice in the 70s and 80s, writing and broadcasting on the discrimination experienced by women in the law as lawyers, but also as users of the law, as victims and defendants. In 1993, she wrote the book Eve Was Framed, Women in British Justice, detailing how England's legal system was failing women. She followed it up in 2018 with Eve Was Shamed, how British justice was still failing women. Her unique skills as an advocate and social reformer have taken her into myriad fields. Chair of the Human Genetics Commission, a decade as TV presenter of Channel 4's After Dark, which is a late-night discussion show, author of 5 books, trustee of the British Museum, board member of the Independent newspaper and Hampstead Theatre, and she's the mother of 3. Her life has been one of mind-boggling activity, and if I list all the honors, awards, and public leadership roles, we won't have time for her talk. So let me proceed on to introduce her accompanying colleague tonight. John Snow, English journalist and television newscaster at Channel 4 News in the UK, has a pretty impressive rap sheet himself. Channel 4 News is an award-winning flagship evening news program in the UK, which Snow has presented on since 1989. To date, the longest-running newscaster. It's a highly rated television news program, which has won numerous awards, which include one to Snow, naming him TV Journalist of the Year for his outstanding contribution to the world of news and current affairs. His award-winning reportage spans years and countries, from stories in Vietnam in 1978 on the plight of the boat people, to coverage of the Civil War in El Salvador, to the rescue of a British ship in the early stages of the Iran-Iraq War, to awards for coverage of Afghanistan, Iran, the Middle East, as well as cholera outbreaks in Haiti in 2010. But I think it's only fair to share this with you. In March 2019, while reporting on a pro-Brexit protest, Snow said, I quote, that he had never seen so many white people in one place. Media regulators received 2,644 complaints about this comment. Viewers considered the comment unnecessary, even racist. A Channel 4 spokeswoman, however, released a statement assuring us that it was an unscripted observation. The media regulators investigated whether they thought the comment broke our rules on offensive content, but ruled in August to clear him over all the remarks. Yeah. Welcome our representative.
Remain seated.
Remain seated.
Yes.
But I just wanted to see everybody, you know. I'll sit down in a moment, but because we'll all get tired, and we'll get tired of seeing me anyway, and then you can just hear me. I think one has to start tonight's story not only with the cost of war in Europe, 2 world wars, 110 million people dead, but also with the gradual disintegration of the British Empire. And these are 2 big factors in where we are today. As far as the war was concerned, Europe, like America, was pretty keen never to see another world war. And it's interesting that the very first stab that anybody had at a united Europe, at a sort of a Europe that got together and did things together, including Germany, was actually in 1948, when there was a Congress in The Hague, which Winston Churchill chaired, a Brit, because the Brits were not, even though they were great liberators, were not yet highly regarded as, and may yet not be highly regarded as Europeans. But anyway, there he was the first one to chair something thinking about how Europe could cohese and prevent war ever happening again. In 1951, the first sort of economic evidence of Europe trying to get together was in the European coal and steel community, which, needless to say, excluded Britain, and which Britain appears not to have wanted any part of. It contained France, Germany, Luxembourg, Italy, Netherlands, West Germany. And it was still focused on trying to ensure that Germany never went to war with its neighbours ever again. And here was the embryo of something which became eventually the European Union. And then there was the Treaty of Rome in 1958. Britain, needless to say, stayed out. France was rather opposed to our membership anyway, and so it was convenient for us not to be part of it. But Britain was not yet thinking of itself as part of Europe, it was thinking of itself as Great Britain. And Great Britain was the Great Britain that had run India, Australia, Canada. I mean, more than half the world was pink. If you looked at a political atlas. But it was rapidly becoming less pink. Australia had gone in the mid-19th century, Canada in the later part of the 19th century, India, gosh, all those people, and all that land, and all the rest of it. That went in 1947. So you imagine, actually, I mean, people bask in the Roman Empire, and are happy to discuss it for a number of centuries. But actually the quite rapid disintegration of the British Empire was quite painful for Brits to behold. And I don't think anybody quite worked out what would fill the void. And in fact, I think a lot of people really felt nothing had gone wrong, because actually it was very quickly the Commonwealth, the British Commonwealth, was formed, and it was a worthy institution in which the idea was that Britain would go on helping a lot of the colonies and the rest of it. But there were still colonies in the early 50s, a lot of Africa, a number of Caribbean islands. There was still a long way to go. So the fact that we were not part of any of these early European endeavours was reasonably explicable, if not necessarily particularly praiseworthy. But anyway, it was down to Harold Wilson, who was a rather successful Labour Prime Minister in 1973, who, in 1973, yes, tried to get us into the European Union, and Monsieur de Gaulle said no. he recognised that Britain was a bit of a threat to French superiority. But in fact, finally, Ted Heath, who was a funny bloke, very, very good pianist, and not really a bad Prime Minister, I mean, considering, bachelor and all the rest of it, it was felt that he needed a wife but never wanted one and all that sort of stuff. But nevertheless, he got us into the European Union. And then it was decided for Britain to have its first ever referendum. I mean, we're a representative democracy. We elect MPs to make decisions. The Prime Minister is thrown up by the Commons and the Lords and all the rest of it. And there are structures, all the rest of it. So this was something very different. We'd never had a referendum. Anyway, amazingly, it went rather well. And the country endorsed being part of the European Union by no fewer than a majority of 9 million, just under 9 million, which is a very, very sizable margin for doing it that way with a direct vote from ordinary members of the public. It should be added at this moment that whilst Britain was embracing referenda, Germany was passing laws never to have another referendum again, for very obvious reasons, that it was referenda that had brought Hitler to power. So, we've got a very interesting development there. Britain suddenly didn't, but in fact, Britain still only ever had 3 referenda, national referenda. One to get into the European Union, one to try and get out, and in the middle there was another one, which I don't think we need to dwell on. I think the big thing then is to recognise that there were then very, very big changes in Europe, very sudden. The wall came down. I myself was a reporter going through Checkpoint Charlie in almost the first wave of any of us who were allowed just to steam through. It was incredible. And we didn't actually know what to do when we got through. We drove just through the gate next to Checkpoint Charlie and just kept driving. And suddenly we were in the middle of sort of nowhere in East Germany, wondering what we should be doing. But we could see tank tracks in the road and all that sort of thing. There were nice spooky things to make you feel you were somewhere relatively unwelcome. But it is an extraordinary thing that the Iron Curtain came down with that big crash, and suddenly people realised the importance of reuniting Germany, of keeping Germany within the European Union, of really everybody binding together to bind Germany in, so there never would be another terrible war like either of the two that have gone before. And we grew to 28 members, and this is an incredible thing that it has held together, and for more than 30 years it's been an interesting experience, because on the one hand it's worked pretty well economically. There have been great tensions because there are people who want in fact to go much further and federalise the whole thing so that we all become Europeans, and you start thinking about speaking other people's languages. We'd be happy with that as long as it was English. The whole idea of a sort of hegemonous sort of institution that was, well, that was too much for quite a lot of people, and a lot too much for the British. And it began to cause serious ructions in the Conservative Party, which has, had a big slab of time in office. It grew to a head within the Conservative Party, not within the country, but within the Conservative Party. And the only way that Prime Minister David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, could see to resolve this problem was to have a referendum. And it was really, the country was going to have a referendum to solve a problem in a political party, which was, again, quite without precedent. Although it would be quite wrong to suggest that all the political parties were united. They weren't. There were splits in the Labour Party as well. But nevertheless, there it was. The referendum was called, and this is the other amazing thing. How could you have a referendum and not say what the margin needed to be for it actually to be of use? And in fact, the margin was only 3%, just under 4%, which is hardly a decisive vote. And in any case, the referendum was advisory. It wasn't even a compulsory, it didn't government didn't have to abide by it really. Indeed, we don't have a written constitution, as you know. There was nowhere in our constitution which said, oh, by the way, if you have a referendum, you must abide by it even if it's under 4%. So we found ourselves in a bigger and bigger mess as time went by, and now we're in a really big mess, with the country split probably more or less down the middle. I'll just say one more thing before turning to my esteemed colleague who knows far more than I do. And she's got a blue legal notebook, which is an intimidating big tab. But anyway, there we were with this incredible situation with the country split and nobody really knowing what on earth to do. And then we produced somebody who had some commonalities with other rulers around the world, and was a shock, but is there, and that's very exciting. And I'm just going to turn to you, because you're going to pick up with that missing constitution.
Okay. Where is Colette?
Here.
There you are. I said, are those reading specs? Because I might occasionally want to have a look at this blue notebook. And you look at the reading glasses I want to borrow. This is what happens with the age, you know. Terrible thing. John's right to start with some of the historical facts about this, because it's very hard for people to understand why this visceral thing is happening in Britain without having some sense of what its roots were. And it is right, I think, as John has said, that you can't see this without understanding the position at the end of the Second World War. A country that had gone through two, you know, as did you, but 2 world wars and economic, you know, crisis in the middle, in between those 2 wars, which in some ways, you know, fired up and were the engine for the arrival of Nazism and fascism in Europe, because of the situation of that terrible economic crisis in the middle. But after the Second World War, I mean, I do think, and I'm sure that this could be debated, but the European Union was a very conscious construct, encouraged both by your country, but also encouraged by Britain, even if it was ambivalent about whether it belonged or not, that the purpose was to be a bulwark against communism. And we have to remember that, you know, what had happened was that, you know, the Soviet Union had been part of the war and all of that, but immediately afterwards there were concerns about working class people, fought of Second World War, but they were then very demanding of what they wanted in terms of politics and what they felt they deserved in terms of their rights and entitlements and decent housing and education for their children and so on. And so the fear was that those demands would trickle in towards communism, and what we ended up having, in a way that perhaps you did in a lesser way, was that we really did embrace the welfare state, and we embraced a whole way in which liberal democracy meant you had to deliver something more than you know, the very basics, that people were entitled to have the protection of knowing that when unemployed that there would be, you know, some way of the state helping, that there would be you know, different kinds of assistance available to people when times got hard, that there would be help in obtaining housing and the like. So all of that was part of a way in which a construction took place, and I know the word socialism in this country is a frightening word, but the idea was that there should be some kind of social democracy, that the social bit was very important, because it was a way of stopping the demands becoming for more. And so it actually led to, I think, a real consensus, a liberal consensus between the main parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party, around what should be made possible and available for ordinary folk. And so it was much, I suspect that unlike now, it was much easier to have a vision, if you were a political party, of what could be offered by way of a manifesto of what the good society would look like. That's changed, and our world has changed. And in many ways, the things that have arrived and which have facilitated the Brexit thing and facilitated Trump for you, social media, you can't get away from the fact that has changed the ways in which communication takes place, and the possibilities for, you know, other participants and people to make use of that methodology to actually contaminate elections. And also, we've seen the rise of populism, and I don't think that you can look at what happened in Britain around Brexit without looking at the rise of populism everywhere. Populism is about simplistic answers to complex problems. And the easy thing about that is that you start saying, who are the people to blame? Who are the cause of your wretchedness? And we had, of course, as you know, an economic crisis in 2008. And in Britain, the argument was made that this was all because of mismanagement of the finances by the Labour government that has been in power since 1997. It was a global crisis, as we know, but it was very cleverly manipulated to say that this was the reason why there had to be austerity policies. And austerity policies were introduced in Britain in a way that really added to the pain of particular communities. And the communities that suffered most were the communities in the north, in the country from which I come from too, in Scotland, and in places where there had been big industrial societies and big industrial cities, and they had, with deindustrialization during the Thatcher years, and you had in the Reagan years, deindustrialization should have called upon progressive parties and parties that believed in the unification of the nation, should have led to really dynamic and visionary responses to deindustrialization, because it was inevitable in some areas that you were going to see changes of that kind. But what we didn't do is invest in the kind of jobs that could have had meaning. Particularly, of course, there was a problem for men because of the emasculation that came with losing their jobs and the failure to actually invest in alternatives. Well, we could have actually trained paramedics. There could have been far more people working in ancillary roles in the National Health Service, where there could have been pride in what they were doing. And the work that is currently available to those people who were traditionally manual workers has been of the most impoverishing kind. It gives no sense of dignity to people. And so when you go to the north of England, if you go up to Scotland and parts of Scotland, what they will say to you is, look at my son, how can he be the father in a family? How can he feel any sense of self-respect with the kind of work where he's got 3 different jobs and none of them pay him a decent, reasonable wage? Here we are having a crisis in Britain around, for example, care, long-term care of the elderly. We need men to be lifting and helping and sorting out care, but why should they do it when people who do that kind of work, women's work, have been paid with such impoverished wages? So the crisis that led to Brexit was a crisis at the door of political parties that failed to deal with changed circumstances in imaginative ways. And so I'm afraid we're not having enough recognition of that, either here in the United States with the Democratic Party, or at home in Britain with the Labour Party, with the sections of the Labour Party that feel that there's nothing that they got wrong, and what we need is just a return to the way that we used to do things. And of course it gave the opportunity for the rise of Jeremy Corbyn as an alternative to that, and yet he has failed to provide the kind of leadership that we had imagined that might come through that. And so we have seen little opposition to the whole business of what's happened around Brexit. And what has happened with Brexit is we've seen the capture of the Conservative Party by the extreme end of the Conservative Party. The castle has been captured. We're seeing a sort of state capture by a small group, but they've been greatly assisted, of course, by Russian intervention, but also assisted by a temperature that is global, which is that globalization has not delivered to many people in our societies. And the rich have done very well out of it, but the poor haven't, and nor indeed have the middle classes. And one of the interesting things about this is that if you look at your demographics, as well as our demographics, is a similar picture, which is that the big cities have done well out of the move towards services, towards the financial sector, the move away from manufacturing, but it's the smaller cities and the towns that have actually suffered hugely and have become barren and have become really hopeless cases, both in Britain, but in other parts of Europe too, because of these shifts. And so Brexit, in some ways, you know, if you look at it, it comes out of similar experiences as the ones that you've had. Now, the Conservative Party has always had this hard core that did not like the idea of Europe. They saw it as too much of a socialist type project. And on the Labour side, funnily enough, the very opposite happened, with the very far, hard left end of the Labour Party feeling that it was a project that was actually to promote the embrace of a kind of capitalism across borders, which would not be good for workers. So back in the 70s, when Harold Wilson was advocating that there should be a joining of the European Union, many people in the Labour Party at that time, trade unionists particularly, were actually very sceptical about it because they thought this is going to be the joining up of capitalism across Europe. Spain was still very poor, Portugal poor, parts of Italy really poor. And so the concern was that in fact they would take jobs and manufacturing would go there, and that people would choose to have their factories in those places where the wages would be even cheaper. And so the collective action would not work. And so that was one of the reasons why there was resistance in certain sections of the Labour Party. But Wilson won the day, talking about the white-hot heat of technology, that the world was changing, that we had to embrace something different, and that we needed to be embracing our neighbours who were nearest to us, and to create a sort of common market. One of the things that has developed along the way, which has actually increased this sort of hardcore opposition in the Conservative Party to the European thing, has been a thing that I actually think has been incredibly valuable, which is a growth in what you might call the social end of what being in the European Union was about. For me, being in the European Union was a project for peace and justice. And it was to prevent war ever happening again in Europe. But it was also about seeking prosperity for the peoples across Europe. And in fact, what happened was that a lot of things came into being that actually were very useful to ordinary workers across borders. So, for example, at the very moment when Mrs. Thatcher in 1979 won the election and said, "I'm going to disempower the trade unions," which indeed she did, and very successfully, was that in Europe, the trade unions were still strong. And so into the European Union law around trading relations were protections for employment. And so, for example, my daughter just now, who's just had a baby, has very good maternity rights that you do not have in this country. And she has them because the European Union absolutely insisted across Europe that there should be strong protections for women taking time out in order to produce the next generation. And so, part-time workers. I'm particularly concerned about this because as a woman, I care about the fact that women, often because of the double burden of looking after the family as well as needing to be financially productive, often take part-time jobs. And you would not get any protections with part-time work. Through Europe, part-time workers are entitled to paid holiday leave and entitled to sick leave as well. So that you actually have protections of the part-time worker, which are incredibly important to women and to the rights of women. And so many of the kind of employment rights that we're concerned about may actually be put in jeopardy, particularly if there's no deal. And let me tell you that an awful lot of people would like that to happen. Because that kind of regulatory framework is seen as being an inhibitor on the maximising of profit. And I tell you what goes on in all of our business schools in the United States and now transported into Britain and Europe, is that the great lesson that you're taught in a business school is that that your responsibility as a person in business is to maximise the profits for your shareholders. And there was a moment in time where I was very excited that when Labour tried to engage with something which was stakeholder interest, which was that you had responsibilities in a company to more than your shareholders, and maximising profit, which would entitle you to minimise wages as much as you possibly could and to drive them down to the lowest level, was that you have responsibilities that go beyond that, to the well-being of society at large. And so some of those things which are actually behind this are actually about deregulation. And deregulation is the real motivator. If you want to ask yourselves what interests Jacob Rees-Mogg Some of you must know who Jacob Rees-Mogg is. He's like some kind of throwback to the 19th century. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who speaks in this incredibly fine Newtonian way, and telling us all how we have to seize back sovereignty and the greatness that is Britain, he has opened up the headquarters of his own finance company in Dublin. So that when the time comes, he'll be all right, Jack, there'll be other folk that won't be. And those kinds of things are happening all the time. Because of the nature and opaqueness of some of the ways in which companies operate, there will actually be protections and ways in which the people who will suffer the consequences of this, of course, are the very people who have been encouraged to vote for it. So what you have is an elitist project that has been wrapped in the flag of nationalism and wrapped in the flag of populism. And of course, populism is sold on the basis that your problems are caused by, first of all, an elite, not the Etonian elite who happen to now be sitting in the cabinet, and not Mr. Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg or whoever. No, the elite are the people who, of course, are the academics in the universities. Mrs. Thatcher very carefully moved things to think tanks, away from the universities as the powerhouse of new ideas and so on, because she felt that they were run and existed as the heartland of left-wing thinking, that it was full of Marxists by all accounts. And all I can tell you is that what we're facing now is a serious moment of crisis. It's a really serious democratic moment for us. Because in order to push this through, and I do believe that a large section of this hard right group actually want no deal, because they are so pro the American way of doing capitalism. And so they actually do want to be doing business in an unregulated way. They do want to be having the kinds of contracts that they would have with Trump. And that is really the way that the route that they want to take. And so we have at the moment our Foreign Secretary travelling around the United States, trying his hardest to win contracts, and I'm sure he'll get them because the promises will be made that we will give up many of the things that we have achieved through being part of the European Union. The European Union protects the environment. The beaches in Britain have greatly improved, the quality of water, many of the things, natural habitats have been improved by virtue of our membership of the European Union and the creation of a framework of regulation across Europe which is protecting the environment. The ways in which we are looking at the business of climate change, you can only do that across borders by working together. Cross-border crime, in great amount of my work has been around trafficking of women and children, but trafficking for all manner of purposes, and cross-border crime. And I'm telling you, the European Union we have a Eurojust system, we have a Euro policing system where there's much greater cooperation, and we have an arrest warrant that runs across Europe. And it works, for example, for battered women. So that when battered women are fleeing from a battering partner, they can go to the police. If he turns up when they're on holiday somewhere with their children, and he turns up thinking that he's away from home and he's going to be able to do nasty things, they can phone the police, and the same injunction that they've got back in Manchester will operate in Spain or in other parts of Europe. And many of those things were struggled for, and it's so interesting. The lie that was told to the British people was that these were all inventions of the European Union. A great wash of law came at us from Europe. We, the British lawyers, were actively involved in the creation of the law around many of these things, around consumers' rights, around employment rights, around things like intellectual property rights, around many of these things that protect our citizens as well as citizens across Europe. And so, and the interesting thing was that it was presented to the public that this is all about sovereignty. This is all about reclaiming our sort of sense of ourselves and our purpose. And in fact, Churchill himself said that in fact, the sacrificing of a piece of sovereignty was worth it for the much greater ideal of wanting to have a society that was at peace, where war became a thing of the past, where you would be actually pursuing justice and prosperity together. And he, in fact, himself spoke about a United States of Europe. God knows what he would say now. I don't know. But it's very interesting. It is very interesting that one of the arguments was made was, how dare a European court tell us what to do? As though the World Trade Organization doesn't have actually what amounts to a court to decide when there are trade disputes. But of course, the truth about all of this is that this was fanned by people whose interests are in the maximizing of profit and so on. It's very interesting that Europe now, of course, has evolved. And so the Central Bank of Europe is very much a neoliberal institution. And it was very much Britain that was at the heart of creating the single market. The single market has 4 freedoms attached to it. Freedom of capital, freedom of services, freedom of, I can't remember, what was it, I'm sure that others come in, and freedom of movement, freedom for people to move and work in other parts of Europe. And those freedoms are sort of, if you like, kind of underpinnings, and we were right in there in the making and creation of those. And then it became that we're having all of this stuff visited on us, and the collusion of the press, our press, in promoting those myths that were not completely true. So I've taken up more than my time, but I just wanted to say, it is no wonder that we've got to the state that we're in. And the sad fact is that the Labour Party at the moment is totally at 6s and 7s. It's not been well led, I'm afraid, and it partly because Jeremy Corbyn himself has voted against everything to do with Europe every single time there has been a vote in Parliament on Europe. He himself is not somebody who is a believer in the European project. Why am I a believer in it? Because I actually think if you want to change things, you have to do it in collaboration with progressive parties across Europe. You have to do it in a way that actually reaches beyond your own borders and your own boundaries. And the idea of hunkering down inside a little Britain, in fact a little England, because Scotland wants to remain part of Europe and will end up going for independence if we're not careful. Northern Ireland voted to stay in the European Union, partly because, of course, the European Union played a very real role and has been very financially active in investing in Northern Ireland to get peace there. And I have spent my life, I've done many cases involving the troubles in Northern Ireland, and the pain that was involved in all of that. The idea that we could be putting it at risk, but I'm afraid some of these people don't really care. So I feel heartbroken about what is currently happening, and I'm fearful that on the 31st of October we may find ourselves no longer in the European Union.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
It's bound and certainly bound to be a very frustrating evening, because the one thing you want to know is what's going to happen. And the truth of the matter is, absolutely nobody knows, except the man sitting in number 10 Downing Street, who has decided that whatever happens, as Helena said, will have left on the 31st of October. But even he cannot guarantee that will happen. So there we are. Yes, sir.
If it offers you any comfort, I'd like to say that
We'd like that.
I'd like to say that our crisis is graver than your crisis. and I say that because, as far as I understand the problems that are strikingly parallel in terms of economics, is that Britain's problem is essentially economic, policy, mechanics, structural, whereas the problem in the United States is cultural. There was a book, I don't know if you've ever heard of it, called What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yeah, I read it.
And it demonstrated pretty conclusively that for many Americans, despite their own pockets being robbed, will rise up over cultural issues against their own self-interest. And I believe that this is in large part due to the fact that America has been animated ever since its beginning by the idea of individual rights versus the common good. And you, for years in Britain, have espoused the common good. Would you comment on that?
I want to bring you comfort. Because actually,
You think it's the other way
when
around?
it comes to chlorinated chicken, Or the possibility that healthcare companies in the United States can bid for great slabs of our National Health Service. People are up in arms. I mean, there is no question that people are beginning to wake up to the reality that you couldn't have, if you had a trade relationship with the United States, which I think would be unlikely that we would actually get a very profound one, given that America first and all the rest of it is currently the genre. The likelihood that people will accept something like chlorinated chicken. I haven't tried chlorinated chicken. Unfortunately, I gave up meat about a year ago, but and I'd be interested to know whether I would actually notice it. But it's been sold as a concept which completely revolts people in Britain. It's a most extraordinary thing, but it is a big issue. And the idea
do you know about chlorinated? Do you know why? It's actually to do with the fact that if you overcrowd, it's partly that the Brits are very big on animal welfare. And so it's partly about the fact that you crush all these chickens into crowded spaces, so they end up not even standing. They're all just because their limbs are soft and so forth. They never strut in around like chickens used to. And because of all of that, they end up having bacteria. They're sitting in their own shit. And so the bacteria grows, and therefore the only way to deal with the high levels of bacteria is to soak them in chlorine before you sell them in Stop and Shop. So at a very cheap level. So if you want cheap chicken, that's how you get it. And so so this has been one of the sort of things that has been discussed in Britain. And of course hormones in beef and that kind of thing.
But to deal more seriously, I mean, I accept your view that it is about economics. But that is a very, very hard thing to discuss with the general public. I mean, it's extremely difficult to make these arguments. They're complex, they have huge ramifications. You know, it was easy in the old days when Labour came in after the Second World War and said we're going to nationalise steel or nationalise coal. People knew that it was going to be taken into public ownership. They didn't know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, but at least there was a clear-cut question of what was actually going to happen. There is no clear-cut question of what's going to happen. It's never happened before. And what is so extraordinary is that these 27 other countries and we pulled together. I mean, look, it's far from perfect. There's nobody could argue. The European Union needs a lot of attention still to perfect it. There are a lot of imperfections, and we've perhaps glossed over them. But I would say that none of them is such that it immobilises it as an option.
You were going to talk about how the referendums actually didn't have any constitutional underpinning, so that we ended up with it being so easily, with just 1% rather than it being.
Yeah, well, I mean, I mentioned that earlier that there was no margin ever spelt out as to what would be required. I mean, in most countries that use referenda a lot, a minimum of 10 or even 15% is required for a major change in the country's constitutional status. Yes, sir.
When you last spoke here about Brexit, amidst all the gloom, I recall you finding some glimmers of hope in the outlook of young people.
Well, I'm such an old optimist.
Should we all be even more depressed that today you didn't find any glimmer of hope in the situation, and compounded maybe by the fact that we read today a poll that says, it was reported in Reuters, that a convincing majority of the British public favours leaving with no agreement.
With no deal.
No, I mean, there are conflicting polls, to be honest. There is comfort to be got from the polls in the sense that they are absolutely inconclusive. You get one poll saying that, and actually they've proved what nonsense polls are in many ways. I mean, and this is such a peculiar issue. People can't. There is no uniform view of any of this. That's the extraordinary thing.
But people have got tired of it. People have got tired.
Yeah.
So I just want to go to a conversation I heard of Pat Buchanan. He had written a book this year. It was with Brian Lamb early this year, and it was recently repeated. It's on Q&A if anybody wants to look for this interview. And he was talking about how He was with Nixon, and actually Nixon did start to see that regulation was good for the environment. You know, he did put in regulations at that time for all the other ills of the man. He did have an American sense. And I do think, I don't think we were all about the independent spirit. I do think that we have that in us, but we also had a common sense of ourselves and a common good. But what he was saying is, now after Johnson, so now you have Kennedy, you have Johnson, the Great American Society, you have this environmental regulations and different regulations being put into place. You know, they're sitting there saying, like, well, how are we going to win? These guys, some of these Republicans, I mean, how are we going to win? I mean, we're up against, you know, this thought, which is actually a good thought. How are we going to share our resources? How are we going to come together? And that's really what America is about, we the people. We are going to decide these things. And he said that we just got in a room and said, well, we're just going to have to change the way people think about things. And that, you know, and the Republicans have a lot of money, or that side, they have the advertising, the businesses, and they could put a lot of resources in the Frank Lutzes of the world. Also in 1970, what wasn't embraced was around the world, there was that Earth Day, and there was a common purpose of the world. We saw what we were doing. We were about to embrace it. We marched in the streets, and that was a threat to the industries, to the industrial giants of the day, the oil and the coal and those who can control those things. And I really do believe that there was this moment in time that was lost, and all of a sudden the conversations, doubt, the science, all of these things started to come into the play and manipulate people's thinking, and we had a Vietnam which could put the Democrats on the ropes. You know, it was a very shameful thing. We never addressed it. So we were in this funny place. And I do think that if we had, at that time, in the European Union, if you had looked at that, if that was created with the intent of the environment and progress and the changeover that this is going to create, because we are changing, we now know what we're doing wrong to the planet, we're going to create a new economy, a new way of going, and we missed that opportunity because people, the powers, not only in this country, but I'm sure in other parts, because there's communication.
Right, well,
Anyway, I just want to say that I just feel that that is part of it. That's just my comment. It's not really a question, but I'm just wondering what you think.
Well, and fun enough, it stimulated me to think that there is something else in play, which we haven't talked about at all, and that's the social network, which in both our countries has played an unbelievably powerful role, an incoherent role, but nevertheless a massive role, in distorting, in obscuring, in trivializing, and in reducing faith in leadership, faith in politics. I mean, the one thing we could probably say is that we think we live on a planet in which there is less good leadership than there's ever been in our lifetimes. That probably isn't true. It's just we didn't know so much about them and we didn't hear from them on their Twitter feed. And this undermining of belief in politics, in the government, in the way in which things are run. Now, of course, it's healthy to some extent to question, but this absolute... Somebody asked me yesterday, if you had to stand up and you had to say, now, if you had to think about the internet, has it been a good or a bad thing? Now, it's impossible to answer that question because the internet has saved lives in all sorts of medical and all sorts of other ways, and it has led to the most amazing discoveries and the rest of it. People have been able to share information that has led humanity to a better place here and there, but it has also produced a cascade of neo-Hitlerian activity in cyberspace, in which really awful distortions of truth are being peddled, and where people in power are, kind of using it in an incredibly dangerous way. And I mean, we just perished at thought had Hitler had the internet. I mean, it wouldn't be just Europe, a whole bang shooting match.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I have a question for you.
No, I was just going to, sorry, I'll come to you in a minute. It's just the one behind. Yeah.
Neither of you have mentioned immigration, and no one in the audience has mentioned immigration. And yet we know that immigration is driven right-wing populism in the Commonwealth, in Brexit, and in the United States. A citizens' assembly of randomly selected British citizens came together and, after listening to experts, asked the organizers to put the question on their ballot of whether you could have in England a law like some of the other laws in Europe, in which after 3 months, someone from another country not having a job could be deported. This is true in European countries. You wouldn't have to change anything about Europe. All you'd have to do is put this law in.
But
The majority of that randomly selected group chose that. I would guess that if that were the referendum, that people would choose to stay in Brexit with that simple change of a law. So I'd like to ask the two of you what you think of that.
Well, Helena will speak to the law. Let me just say one thing, though, that Britain is completely dependent on immigration. This year we have the largest number of immigrants
The United States is too.
we've ever had.
That's not
We're talking 250,000 people coming in now. Now, the interesting thing is that most of them are Europeans, because they can freely move from within the European Union. Now, race is a massive element in the whole question of how you feel about immigration. And in fact, the consequence of leaving the European Union will be to close off the paths for the white Europeans coming in, and instead we will have to turn to India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, wherever we can find people who want to come to Britain and work. That is the sort of irony of where we are. I mean, the fact is, neither of our societies could work without immigration. We are utterly dependent upon it for fundamental labour supply in both our countries. Why that is the case is another thing we can talk about at another time. But as things stand, that's the way it is. What about the law?
The truth is that that struggle around immigration is one that both parties have, and it's one also is happening here. The other day I was at a gathering in which that was one of the things that was presented, was that, you know, the Democrats should have got to grips with something around immigration a long time ago, and some of the people in the room were aghast at even the thought of it, that this great nation built on immigration should even conceive of doing such a thing. In Britain, the talk now is about taking on an Australian process, which is that you actually that people come in based on skills, the skills that are needed. But in truth, in Britain, a large number of the jobs are not skilled jobs, the ones that are done by immigrants. The other thing that we have that is I think is a kind of crazy thing, is that people who come seeking asylum, people who are coming from places in which they're fleeing war, people are coming fleeing persecution. When they're coming in droves like that, there has to be processes. We have obligations internationally about taking people in. And actually, when the sense you get in that kind of polling that we've been talking about is that people don't want to even be engaging with giving people places who are coming on asylum. We do not let asylum seekers work. While they're being processed and it can take ages, they're not allowed to work. And so it's dealt with in the most kind of basic way. And many of those people, if they're given a refusal and then they're going to appeal, then they can't have access to public funding, and it's charitable organisations and churches and so on that look after them. So in many of these areas, it's actually more complicated than giving them the offer that you're suggesting, which is, if people basically, I haven't got themselves a job, then they're going to be deported, then you have to find them and round them up, and you'd have to be able to say, are you legitimately here? And do you ask every person with brown skin, or every person who might look vaguely foreign? It's difficult. How do you start deciding who's to be deported after you have 3 months if they haven't got a job? And so what people are saying now is they shouldn't be coming in unless they've got a job before they actually come. You have to be able to arrive at the desk and say, I've got this job, and show that they've got a job waiting for them. So your solution wouldn't work. Your solution really wouldn't work. Because what do you want? What kind of society do you create where you start rounding up people to find out who should be deported because they haven't got themselves a job within 3 months? It doesn't work. So you know, it's not as straightforward as you think. The free movement thing in Europe, actually, we got ourselves in a bind over that because we wanted people to come in, because we were looking for care workers, we were looking for people who would be working for very little money. And if you're Bulgarian or Romanian, then you know the money you earn, even low wages in Britain, are very good to be sending home to your family, to your mother, to your other people in your family, and that kind of remittance. But then the public found that, for example, Poles working in Britain could claim child benefit for children they had back in Poland. And so people got affronted by it. And the idea was that you were entitled to benefits in the same way that a British person would be, because you're part of the European Union. And so when people found that you could get a child benefits for children you had back in Poland, people were outraged. And so some of this was messy. And there's no doubt that, I mean, one of the slogans that's used by the Remain campaign is Remain and Reform. That there needs to be reform of many different aspects of being in Europe. But that's not a good reason, because you want to reform it is not a good reason for pulling away from it and not being in it and not being part of this bigger thing. These are our nearest neighbours. 7% of our trading is with Europe, and we're going to be pulling away from that. I mean, it's madness. But of course, the people who will suffer will be ordinary people. And one of the things that has happened, and I would say this for myself as well as other people, is that we've learned so much about what actually are the benefits that come to us. Our scientific community in Britain gets a huge amount of money from Europe. We're very good at science. And when it comes to the big grants of collaborative work on things around medicine, around all sorts of things, Britain gets a lion's share of it. Oxford gets the biggest set of grants of any university across Europe coming out of European Union money. And so, you know, I mean, all of that is in jeopardy. And tons of that kind of thing that people didn't know about. Really incredible stuff. Around, for example, if people are married to somebody who's Italian, the courts collaborate if there's a divorce and access to children and all of that kind of thing. It's been evolved over 40-odd years now. And it has been working well. So lawyers, you know, have come in front of the committee. I chair a select committee in the House of Lords on European Union and justice, and I've had huge swathes of organisations of lawyers, corporate lawyers, commercial lawyers, intellectual property lawyers, family lawyers, all coming from their professional organisations to say, what is going to happen about all this law that exists that makes our working together so successful?
I did promise you, didn't I?
Thank you. I have a question, Helena, about what will happen with the board. Can you predict what will happen if there is no agreement on October 31st? And what will happen with the Northern Irish border? There's great concern in the Republic about that.
Well, I mean, it is one of the areas that causes great anxiety. I mean, one of the things that's been said is that it can all be done electronically, you know, and it is true. I mean, one of the things that our committee did was that we heard evidence from border control running in the border between Sweden and Norway, or the border between Italy and Switzerland. You know, how are things done? And one of the things that happens is that if you are a regular container lorry taking certain commodities across borders, you can start doing it by, you know, you email in what's going to be in your container lorry, and every week it's almost the same thing. So that can be done. But what's going to happen about one of the things that people were stirred up to be very excited about, which is people? How are you going to deal with the fact that Bulgarians and Romanians are going to be able to go into Dublin and just, if they keep the border open, just cross over this only electronically looked after border, and then have free passage into Britain? How are you going to man that if you don't have a hard border? And what we say is a hard border is going to be fought over.
But there hasn't been one of these borders ever anywhere in the world. They're dreaming up something which doesn't exist.
It hasn't, yeah.
And what is so absolutely unbelievable is that the pain, the suffering that the United Kingdom went through, and Ireland in particular, Northern Ireland and Ireland, with that war, which was a civil war which lasted 3 decades, claimed the lives of 3,500 people, had bombings in London, bombings in other cities, Birmingham, Manchester, etc. And it will happen again, because the tribal tensions still exist. And believe the present government is even propped up by a political force that is very closely allied to radical Protestantism, which doesn't work easily in a democratic society. And you have the Catholic majority in the south. The idea that you're going to have some as yet never tried before border system that's going to somehow, I mean, the European Union by definition cannot afford to have a border that doesn't work. Forget the human beings, it's the goods. I mean, the smuggling, the whole thing. And I don't really anyone want to be naughty about Ireland, but they do know quite a lot about smuggling up there. You know, it's I think it may yet be the issue which becomes completely insoluble. Yes.
Yes, I'm trying to think of framing a question which will give you an excuse to be optimistic.
Yes, I am an optimist, I'll tell you.
So my question is there any hope that before October 31st, when Parliament reconvenes, that you could have a vote of no confidence in Boris, which would collapse that government and have a general election before October 31st? Is that
Well,
feasible?
I mean, there's been lots of propaganda that that can't happen, but it will, or could. I think it's perfectly possible that something will happen. People say that there's part of him wants an election anyway, but he said he wouldn't have one before the 31st. So
It's difficult to know. I mean, one of the things is that the Parliament itself, the Commons, is against no deal. And there are people in the Conservative Party who feel strongly enough about this that they will align themselves with the other parties and that they will vote again to say no deal. But you've got to remember, this has been voted on in the Commons several times already, so it's not as if people don't know. And we voted already several times in the House of Lords, saying exactly that no deal is so damaging to our economy and such a disastrous thing that it can't be contemplated. So those votes have gone through. The problem is, and I can tell you that I got together with a retired parliamentary draftsman. We drafted a bill, a little Kennedy bill, that says, which is about rescinding Article 50 and basically revoking our leaving. Which of course is possible that you could have an election and then say, do you really want us to leave? And then it could be started all over again. However, that little bill I put together, the problem about it is this. The only people who can initiate that successfully is government. Mm-hmm. It can't be done as a private member's bill. There was a moment where, rather ingeniously, and with the assistance of John Bercow, who's the Speaker in the House, who's supposed to look after the interests of the backbenchers, not the executive. He's supposed to help empower backbenchers against the executive. He allowed them to take control of the business on certain days. And the hope I had was that this bill might find some favour if that could be done again in this next period. But I don't think it's going to be very easy to get that recovery of business being taken over by the backbenchers themselves. And that was done by a coalition of people in the different parties, and both Conservative and Lib Dems and Labour people got together to do that. And so, is there something left in that? We're all trying to be as inventive as possible around it. But I don't think, I think that the no deal thing, the Parliament is saying they don't want it. But now you're hearing that there is this business of the public who are getting sort of weary of this. And then nothing is happening in our country because of Brexit. They want to hear about housing. They want to hear about what's going to happen with social care. And so, I live in anxiety about it. It's my optimism. The only area of optimism that I do have is that if there was some sort of resurgence around the idea that if there is going to be a deal, and if Boris managed to get something that he was able to spin as being a new deal, very different from Theresa May's, if that were possible, to argue that it has to go to the people again to see whether they've changed their minds or not, and whether something happened around that. That's the only thing that I can imagine, but I can't see.
Yes.
Time.
Hi, I just wanted to add a little comment about the Northern Ireland aspect.
Oh, good.
Or as we like to refer to it, the north of Ireland.
Yes.
I was very fortunate to be born on the island of Ireland. I was unfortunate to grow up in the northern part of the island, where as an Irish citizen I was looked upon as a second-class citizen. Now, in terms of a no deal and a hard border coming back to the northern part of our Ireland, there are all the smuggling aspects, there are all the economic disadvantages, and there's an absolute human rights aspect as well, which has been sometimes very misrepresented by the media across the world. I was a little girl, I grew up in that hard border. I came back and forth. We had to drive 5 miles down the road to fill the car up with petrol. We had to use a different currency, although I was Irish. We had to use sterling. We still have to drive across that border, although we're still part of the European Union, and work in euros when we go there. But more profound, I for years drove across that border. We were stopped by the British Army. My family were taken out. They were beaten, black and blue. I sat there, a little girl, and I watched my father being dragged out of the car, taken off to Gough internment camp, kept there for hours, and we were made sit in that car until they came back again. And I know that you've represented the Guildford Four, and I'm not very familiar, but very appreciative for the work that you've done, with a lot of issues for those of us that grew up in the northern part of the island. Many of my friends were shot and killed on that border. Just recently, there was a case that had gone on for years and years and years. Mr. McInnesby was coming home from a football game, an Irish football game, walking home in his football strip, and they opened fire and shot him dead. So there's the whole economic aspects of it, which I totally appreciate, but there's also, believe me, we have worked really hard in the northern part of our Ireland, and I'm one who grew up, I have 4 children, and I always taught my children to be progressive, to look forward, as you said, to come together, to work to ways to not have the bomb and the bullet, and engage in political discussion, and we've done all of that. But we've still a long way to go. 1995, we had the Good Friday Agreement. We are still working very, very, very patiently to get all aspects of that instated. One of them, we have no government in the north of Ireland, we have working government right now, because in that agreement, there was an agreement for the Irish Language Act.
Yes.
Our language that was wiped out many years ago, our religion, people were executed for speaking their language and for practicing their religion. And we're still waiting on that even to be reinstated. So we're really, really worried about, while we're still working through all of those aspects, what's going to happen on a human rights issue if that border is reinstated. So I just wanted to add that to your commentary.
Here, here.
Well, it's a great tribute to Wellfleet and to you to coincide, and you were able to speak to us. Thank you very much indeed. I mean, it is extraordinary that when peace was made, and after all, Nobel Prizes were settled on the peacemakers, that this, 3 decades later, can be conceived as possible, that you'll tear the thing up and let this bloodshed and the rest of it flow. I am an optimistic. I am an optimist. I cannot believe. Incidentally, anybody got confused by Article 50. Article 50 is part of the European Constitution, and if you decide you want to leave, you can trigger it by triggering this Article 50, and that's what we've done. But I think anything is possible. Anything is possible. We're living in an age of extraordinary uncertainty, and I am optimistic enough to believe that one of the things that can happen is this will be resolved some other way. there are two things which haven't been mentioned, two words that haven't been mentioned. And one is austerity, and the other is inequality. The bankers' crisis in Britain was dealt with by the government making swingeing cuts in public expenditure, which meant that a lot of people in the poorer parts of Britain suffered very, very badly. And interestingly enough, the demography of the votes against Europe were very, very strong in areas of great poverty. I mean, what had they to vote for? I mean, you visit austerity on a community, and then you say, by the way, would you like to leave Europe? Europe, incidentally, was not amongst the top 12 issues in anybody's daily sort of thought processing. It, of course, became the top for totally irrational reasons. And whether you believed in it or you didn't, it became incredibly important and has resulted in this terrible division. I don't know what time we're supposed to...
Whenever you get tired, tell us.
No. I mean, you've got to say. Look, this
I think 5 more minutes and we'll finish. Yeah.
5 British minutes. Yes.
For me, perhaps the most shocking aspect of Brexit has been the paralysis of the Labour Party. And I know you specifically mentioned Jeremy Corbyn, but it seems hard to believe that what the thoughts he is reputed to have, thinking of the EU as a bankers' club, would be enough to sway the entire party, so that it was so stunningly ineffectual in 2016. And you were mentioning regionality. My husband comes from Birkenhead in Merseyside,
Yes.
and all around people that we knew, also my dying mother-in-law under austerity, lifelong Labour supporters, voted to leave Europe because they were so angry and disgusted at what had happened to their livelihoods and to the collapse of social services, that they struck out at what seemed to them to be the furthest away power that might be manipulating them, and that was Europe. And the Labour Party did nothing to prevent this. And I'm wondering, searching for optimism.
It's important to deal with that.
Yeah.
Because I feel that frustration too.
Yeah.
Which is that I feel that there was an argument to be made, which was about how wrong austerity was. But unfortunately, we were still living with the aftermath of New Labour. And in the way that Hillary also lived with the aftermath of new democracy or new democratic politics, which is that was this idea that somehow this business of the financial sector being the great mechanism for growth and so on, that it all trickled around the country. Well, it certainly wasn't trickling to many of those places, and people were angry.
Yeah.
And Labour needed to be making the argument about, yes, we failed. We failed at a period when we were in government, we didn't do enough to deal with that.
Yeah.
And we were distracted about all the other things that we thought were going to be delivering good things. And we didn't do the right thing there. And so people were angry, and it was not addressed. And the problem about it was that Jeremy Corbyn himself who's a very good canvasser, very good on the hustings, to all intents and purposes, but he did not make the case for Europe because he doesn't believe in it.
Yeah.
And so the people did, many people did. But there was a thing that was a hangover from the Scottish referendum. There had been a referendum only a couple of years before on independence for Scotland. Yeah. And at that time, Labour shared platforms with the Conservative Party, and it was claimed that one of the reasons why it was such touch and go was because it was so terrible to see Labour in, Gordon Brown and Tony Blair and people like that on the same platforms along with David Cameron, along with Conservatives, and it was like there's not an inch between them. They're all the same, right? Yeah. And that was the line. And that was the line that the Scottish nationalists ran with. And so when it came to the point of the referendum in 2016, Corbyn would not go out there and share any kind of platform with anybody and kept well away from any of the people who were arguing for Remain. And of course, David Cameron was arguing for Remain. And so, there was a problem for Labour about who its leader was, and about the fact that, the government of the day, which had brought austerity to roost on many ordinary people, were responsible. Labour has blown it. It has not handled any of this well as, of course, the other problems around the issue of anti-Semitism. But Labour really is not in a good place at this moment. So if there was the election that you're talking about, it's very hard to know what could happen. I think Boris Johnson could very easily win. And so, there really is an issue around leadership, as John was saying, about political leadership. And so I do think that Labour failed many of the people who basically had always looked to Labour and been loyal to Labour. But it's not just, you see this business, it's a very easy picture to paint, as in this country too, that it's only, that it was mainly working class people who voted for Brexit. It wasn't. I sit in the House of Lords and I listen to a whole lot of people who are representative of a particular part of Britain, who has a nostalgia for a Britain that no longer exists, that who remember when it was all, green and pleasant land, and where there weren't so many people from other countries and immigrants and all this diversity. They don't like it. They don't like the idea that there's homosexual marriage. They don't like all of this stuff that they can consider to be about political correctness and newfangled stuff. And so when our colleague was talking about the cultural thing, there are people in Britain who also feel like people in the United States, that they feel that somehow the Britain that they knew has been taken away from them. And they cut across the classes. And there are plenty of middle-class people who are Brexiteers, and there are plenty of upper middle-class and aristocratic people who are Brexiteers. And it's about that somehow a nostalgia for a world that is gone. And they just cannot get to grips with the new world.
Do you want to end on nostalgia?
On nostalgia? Yeah.
Shall we squeeze one last question? Yeah. Shall we squeeze one last question in?
Okay.
Who? Yes.
Colette.
I'd like you to follow up on what you just said and really, both of you, to speak more to, I think, something that this young lady talked about, but it seems to me that the fundamental, at least co-equal part of what's going on here really doesn't have to do with economics and jobs and borders, and that's what you're talking about now. And I wish you would just say more about how you see what I take to be the cultural and psychological part of this in the Brexit vote, which seems really central in what you read, what you see. I happen to have been in England the day that Johnson was in office. He was in fact meeting in the same building that this conference I was in, or was talking in the same building. There's something about that part of things that seems really central, and central in this country as well, which is a bit of an anger about displacement and a rage and concepts about what's fair and unfair, and it's really not about what
You see, I think that in
economic interests are.
I don't think you can take away the economic thing.
No,
It's absolutely clear.
Talk about the other part too.
But there's other stuff too. And I think that what and let's just think about it in even a wider landscape. You have Orban saying, we don't need liberal democracy. Democracy is good enough, right? The untangling of liberalism from the notion of democracy. And populism is about, and he has talked about it, his whole thing is that you go after your opponents, you create enemies, and so that, of course, is part of the business of going after immigrants, but it can be George Soros, or it can be whoever. You go after, you create people who are the bogeymen for ordinary folk, who are really undermining their world. And for many people, for example, I'm a human rights lawyer, human rights lawyers are the enemy too. Anything that they see as being about a sort of political correctness, giving rights to people who don't deserve to have the rights because they're criminals or because they're terrorists or because they're homosexuals or because they're bloody women and difficult women to boot and all of that stuff. So there's a way in which there's a lot of anger around, but we're seeing something that did exist after the Second World War, which was a liberal consensus. And it didn't matter which political party you were in, that liberal consensus bound people together. That is unraveling. And so you have to look at the business of what's happening to that liberalism. And the voices of the illiberal are becoming louder. And people are also jumping on that bandwagon because it is a useful way of running politics. The rule of law is being undermined in lots of places. And we should be really, we have to be the custodians of it. I mean, I, as a lawyer, feel that we absolutely have to be protecting the rule of law. And the rule of law in the modern world is imbued with human rights. It means the protection of the dignity of each and every one of us, whoever we are, whatever our colour or religion or whatever. But I'm telling you, we're seeing it being undermined in every country, all across Europe, Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic. It's all being unravelled. Judges being removed from office because they don't like them making independent decisions which are not in line with what the government's doing. We're seeing it at the UN with people being expected to be not independent-minded people, but there to be doing the bidding of the government that has put them there. All of that stuff is happening everywhere, and we are not immune from it. And I think that for a long time we imagined that we were. And the spectacle of what's been happening in our parliament is an example of it, but also what's happening in relation to law and the protections of human rights. So there's something ugly happening. And Northern Ireland, I mean, when we're talking about the North, the DUP, which is refusing to let Irish people be able to speak their own language, which refuses to let women have abortion, even if they've been raped, which refuses to acknowledge that homosexuals might want to love and be loved and have relationships in an open way. They are the most narrow-minded crowd of folk on the British Isles, and they are the people who are keeping our government in place. So it's that we're living in bad times. So when we're talking about looking for optimism, we have to be louder in opposing some of this stuff, because this is the stuff, this is the mortar that keeps good societies together.
Follow that, except that I would argue that we are living in an age in which community, in which generosity, in which charity, in which preparedness to make a difference with it. I looking around this room, I know it's Wellfleet, it's a bit sort of odd in the rest of it, but I think I can be confident that virtually everybody in this room has done something in this year which has made a difference to somebody else's life that they never knew anything about. And that is reassuring, that we still care for each other and for others. There are things going wrong with our administrative structures and the rest of it, as Helena's pointed out. But we're still good and decent people and capable of doing things for each other. And that's what keeps me optimistic. And I believe we'll come out of this, just as you will come out of your tunnel, to a greener, more pleasant and more exciting time.